The old brass key turned reluctantly in the lock, its resistance a harbinger of the secrets that lay beyond. Julia Davenport, her slender fingers wrapped around the tarnished metal, felt a shiver course through her body as the mechanism finally yielded with a dull click. The heavy oak door creaked open, revealing a darkness so profound it seemed to leak out into the dim hallway where she stood. Julia hesitated, her hand hovering over the light switch. For a moment she considered turning back, abandoning this peculiar commission that had brought her to the outskirts of the city, to this decaying mansion that housed the Blackwood Museum. But curiosity, that relentless taskmaster of the inquisitive mind, urged her forward. With a deep breath, she flicked the switch. Julia stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. She was here for a purpose, to restore the lost works of Elias Wren, a painter whose name had been all but erased from the annals of art history. It was a commission that promised to revive her flagging career as an art restorer, a chance to uncover a hidden chapter in the grand narrative of human creativity. But as she surveyed the room, a sense of unease settled over her like a shroud. The paintings seemed to watch her, their subjects' eyes following her movements with an unnerving intensity. Julia shook her head, dismissing the notion as a trick of the light and her own overactive imagination. She approached the first painting, a portrait of a woman in Victorian dress. The canvas was caked with grime, the once vibrant colors muted beneath layers of dust and yellowed varnish. Julia leaned in closer, her trained eye already assessing the work needed to bring this piece back to life. As she examined the portrait, a flicker of movement caught her attention. For a split second, she could have sworn the woman's eyes had shifted, meeting her gaze with a look of desperate pleading. Julia jerked back, her heart pounding. She blinked rapidly, and when she looked again, the portrait was as still and lifeless as before. "Ms. Davenport?" The voice, sudden and sonorous, caused Julia to spin around with a startled gasp. Standing in the doorway was a tall, gaunt man, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit that seemed at odds with the dilapidated surroundings. His face was pale and angular, with deep-set eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intensity. "Mr. Blackwood," Julia said, willing her racing heart to calm. "I apologize, I didn't hear you come in." The man's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "No need for apologies. I see you've already begun your assessment of the collection." Julia nodded, gesturing to the portrait she had been examining. "Yes, there's quite a bit of work to be done. The damage is extensive but not irreparable. With time and care, we should be able to restore these pieces to their former glory." Mr. Blackwood's eyes seemed to glitter at her words. "Excellent. I knew I had chosen the right person for this task. Elias Wren's work deserves nothing less than the most skilled hands to bring it back into the light." There was something in the way he spoke of Wren that sent a chill down Julia's spine. It was more than mere admiration. It bordered on reverence, an almost religious fervor that seemed out of place for a simple art collector. "If you don't mind my asking," Julia ventured, "how did you come to acquire such an extensive collection of Wren's work? I was under the impression that most of his paintings had been lost or destroyed." Mr. Blackwood's expression darkened momentarily before smoothing into a mask of polite interest. "Ah, that is a long and rather complicated story, Ms. Davenport. Perhaps we can discuss it over dinner once you've had a chance to settle in and begin your work." Julia frowned. "Settle in? I'm sorry, but I thought this was to be a day job. I have accommodations in the city." "I'm afraid that won't do," Mr. Blackwood interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "The work you'll be doing is far too delicate and time-consuming to allow for daily commutes. I've prepared a suite for you here in the museum. You'll find it has all the amenities you require, and it will allow you to fully immerse yourself in the restoration process." Before Julia could protest, Mr. Blackwood produced a small leather-bound book from his pocket. "This is Wren's journal," he said, holding it out to her. "It contains details of his techniques and the materials he used. You'll find it invaluable in your work." Julia took the journal hesitantly, its weight in her hand seeming far greater than its size would suggest. As her fingers brushed the worn leather cover, she felt a jolt, as if a static charge had passed between her and the book. Mr. Blackwood's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, a look of satisfaction flitting across his features. "I'll leave you to get acquainted with your workspace," he said, turning to leave. "Dinner will be served at 8. We have much to discuss." As the door closed behind him, Julia found herself alone once more in the vast gallery. She opened the journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting that filled its pages was spidery and erratic, the words sometimes trailing off into indecipherable scribbles. As she leafed through the book, her eyes were drawn to a particular passage. The secret lies not in the pigments or the canvas, but in the very essence of life itself. To truly capture a subject is to imprison their soul, to create a window into eternity. But such power comes at a terrible price. Julia snapped the book shut, a sudden wave of nausea washing over her. She looked up at the paintings surrounding her, and for a moment, she could have sworn she saw a collective shudder pass through the frozen figures on the canvases. As she set up her restoration equipment, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that she had stepped into something far beyond her understanding. The paintings loomed around her, their presence oppressive and watchful. She tried to focus on the task at hand, but her mind kept returning to the unsettling words in Wren's journal. Days passed in a blur of meticulous work and sleepless nights. Julia found herself losing track of time, the hours blending together in the unchanging light of the gallery. She worked tirelessly, cleaning away decades of grime and neglect from Wren's paintings. But with each layer she removed, each detail she uncovered, a growing sense of dread took root in her heart. The portraits seemed to come alive under her touch, their eyes following her every move. Landscapes shifted when she wasn't looking directly at them, revealing hidden paths and ominous structures that hadn't been there before. And always, there was the whisper of voices just beyond the edge of hearing, murmuring words she couldn't quite make out. One evening, as Julia was working late into the night on a particularly challenging piece, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the background of the painting, partially obscured by a gnarled tree, was a face she recognized. It was her own face staring back at her with an expression of abject terror. Julia stumbled back, knocking over her easel and sending her tools clattering to the floor. She blinked hard, convinced she must be hallucinating from exhaustion. But when she looked again, the face was still there, now seeming to silently scream for help. With trembling hands, she reached for Wren's journal, frantically flipping through its pages. There had to be an explanation, some trick of the light or quirk of the restoration process that could account for what she was seeing. But as she read, the horrible truth began to dawn on her. Wren had indeed found a way to capture life in his paintings, but not in the way she had initially understood. The subjects of his portraits weren't merely representations. They were the actual souls of the people he had painted, trapped for eternity in a prison of canvas and oil. And now somehow Julia was becoming a part of this nightmarish gallery. Her reflection in the painting was no illusion. It was a glimpse of her own impending fate. As this realization washed over her, Julia heard the sound of footsteps approaching. The door to the gallery swung open, revealing Mr. Blackwood. His face was a mask of triumph and madness. "Ah, Miss Davenport," he said, his voice dripping with sinister satisfaction. "I see you've finally understood the true nature of Wren's work, and your own role in continuing his legacy." Julia backed away, her eyes darting between Blackwood and the nightmarish paintings that surrounded her. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figures in the paintings seemed to lean forward, their eyes glowing with a hunger that had waited decades to be sated. As Blackwood advanced, Julia felt the cold touch of canvas against her back. She turned to find herself face to face with the unfinished painting she had noticed on her first day, the one that had been nothing but a blank canvas. Now, to her horror, she saw that it bore the beginnings of a new portrait, her own portrait. The brushstrokes seemed to move of their own accord, filling in the details of her face, capturing the terror in her eyes. Julia tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, helpless as the painting drew her in. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Mr. Blackwood's triumphant smile and the eager, hungry faces of the other trapped souls, welcoming her to their eternal gallery. As Julia's consciousness faded, merging with the paint and canvas, a new figure appeared in the doorway of the Blackwood Museum. Another art restorer, summoned to continue the work on Elias Wren's cursed masterpieces. And in a freshly completed portrait, Julia Davenport's eyes gleamed with newfound awareness. silently screaming a warning that would never be heard. The old grandfather clock in the corner of the Blackwood Museum's main gallery chimed midnight, its sonorous tones echoing through the cavernous space. Amelia Fenton, the newly arrived art restorer, jolted awake from her fitful slumber at her workstation. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind as she struggled to remember where she was and why she felt an inexplicable sense of dread. It had been 2 weeks since she'd arrived at the museum, eager to take on the challenge of restoring the lost works of Elias Wren. The job offer had seemed too good to be true, a chance to work on a virtually unknown artist's collection with the promise of reviving her own faltering career. But now, as she looked around at the dimly lit gallery, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a terrible mistake. Her gaze fell upon the portrait she had been working on before exhaustion had overtaken her. It was a striking piece, depicting a woman with auburn hair and piercing green eyes. There was something hauntingly familiar about the subject, though Amelia couldn't quite place where she might have seen her before. As she leaned in to examine her progress, a chill ran down her spine. The woman's eyes, which she could have sworn were closed when she'd started working, were now wide open, staring directly at her with an intensity that seemed to transcend the boundaries of paint and canvas. Amelia stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. "This is impossible," she muttered, rubbing her eyes furiously. When she looked again, the portrait had returned to its original state, the woman's eyes closed as if in peaceful slumber. Trying to calm her frayed nerves, Amelia reached for the leather-bound journal that Mr. Blackwood had given her upon her arrival. It was supposed to contain Elias Wren's notes on his techniques and materials, but so far, she had found it to be a confused jumble of ramblings and cryptic symbols. As she flipped through the pages, a loose sheet of paper fluttered to the floor. Amelia bent to retrieve it, noticing that it was different from the yellowed pages of the journal. This paper was crisp and white, the handwriting neat and modern. Her blood ran cold as she read the hastily scrawled message. "To whoever finds this, get out now. The paintings are alive. Wren found a way to trap souls in his art. Mr. Blackwood is..." The note ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted. With trembling hands, Amelia turned the paper over, searching for more, but the back was blank. She recognized the handwriting. It belonged to Julia Davenport, the previous restorer who had mysteriously disappeared just before Amelia's arrival. A soft sound like the whisper of fabric against canvas made Amelia whirl around. The gallery seemed to have come alive in the dim light. Shadows danced at the corners of her vision, and she could have sworn she saw figures moving within the frames of the paintings. "Miss Fenton?" The voice, sudden and close, caused Amelia to let out a strangled cry. Mr. Blackwood stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the darkness of the hallway beyond. His pale face seemed to glow in the gloom, his deep-set eyes fixed on Amelia with an unsettling intensity. "I'm sorry to startle you," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "I heard noises and thought I should check if everything was all right." Amelia clutched Julia's note behind her back, her mind racing. "I'm fine, Mr. Blackwood, just working late and must have dozed off." Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, Amelia thought she saw a flicker of something dark and hungry in their depths. "You've been making excellent progress," he said, gesturing to the portrait she had been working on. "Elias Wren's brilliance is truly starting to shine through." As if on cue, Amelia felt a tugging sensation, as though the painting behind her was trying to draw her in. She resisted the urge to turn and look, keeping her eyes fixed on Blackwood. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "I was wondering if you could tell me more about the previous restorer, Julia Davenport. What exactly happened to her?" A shadow passed over Blackwood's face, quickly replaced by a mask of polite concern. "Ah, poor Julia. She was a talented artist, but I'm afraid the pressure of the work got to her. She suffered some kind of breakdown and had to leave abruptly. It's a shame, really. She was making such progress." Amelia's grip tightened on the note hidden behind her back. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to her core, that Blackwood was lying. "Now then," Blackwood continued, his tone suddenly brisk. "It's late and you should get some rest. Tomorrow is an important day. We'll be unveiling the first of the restored paintings to a select group of collectors." As he turned to leave, Blackwood paused, his hand on the doorframe. "Oh, and Miss Fenton? I'd advise against wandering the museum at night. Some of the floors are quite unstable, and we wouldn't want any accidents." The threat in his words was thinly veiled, and Amelia felt her heart rate spike. As soon as Blackwood's footsteps had faded away, she sprinted back to her room, locking the door behind her. Sleep eluded her that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces from Wren's paintings, their expressions twisted in anguish and desperation. In her dreams, she heard their whispers, pleading for release from their painted prisons. Morning arrived, gray and oppressive. Amelia dressed mechanically, her mind churning with plans of escape. But as she stepped out of her room, she found Mr. Blackwood waiting for her, a cold smile on his lips. Miss Fenton, I trust you're ready for our big day?" Trapped in Blackwood's unwavering gaze, Amelia nodded mutely. As he led her toward the main gallery, she felt as though she were walking to her own execution. The gallery had been transformed overnight. The sheets covering the furniture had been removed, revealing ornate Victorian chairs and tables. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the space, and the newly restored paintings gleamed in their freshly polished frames. A small group of people milled about, sipping champagne and murmuring in hushed, reverential tones as they admired the artwork. Amelia's eyes darted around, searching for a friendly face, someone who might help her. But the collectors all had the same hungry look in their eyes that she had seen in Blackwood's. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood's voice rang out, silencing the murmurs. "I want to thank you all for coming to this exclusive viewing of Elias Wren's newly restored masterpieces. And of course, we owe a debt of gratitude to our talented restorer, Ms. Amelia Fenton." All eyes turned to Amelia, and she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The gazes fixed upon her were not those of art enthusiasts admiring her work. They were the eyes of predators sizing up their prey. "Now," Blackwood continued, "I'd like to draw your attention to our pièce de résistance, a work that has only recently been completed." It was Julia Davenport. The portrait captured Julia in exquisite, terrifying detail. She stood in what appeared to be the very gallery they were now in, her face a mask of horror as she reached out toward the viewer, as if begging for help. Behind her, the other paintings in Wren's collection loomed, their subjects watching with a mixture of pity and grim satisfaction. But it was Julia's eyes that truly captured the horror of the scene. They were alive with a desperation that no ordinary painting could convey. As Amelia stared, transfixed, she saw Julia's lips move, forming two silent words. "Help me." A hand clasped Amelia's shoulder, making her jump. Blackwood stood beside her, his grip painfully tight. "Magnificent, isn't it?" he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "You've outdone yourself, my dear." Amelia shook her head, her voice a hoarse whisper. "I didn't paint this. I've never seen it before." Blackwood's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. "Oh, but you did. In a way, we all did. Elias Wren started it, but it takes many hands to complete his work, to feed the hunger of the canvas." As if responding to his words, the paintings around them seemed to pulse with an inner light. The figures within stirred, their eyes fixing on Amelia with a hunger that made her skin crawl. "You see," Blackwood continued, his voice taking on a dreamy quality, "Wren discovered that true art, living art, requires sacrifice. The artist must give a piece of themselves, their soul, if you will, to bring their creations to life. But Wren found a way to use the souls of others." Amelia's mind reeled as the horrible truth dawned on her. The disappearances, the strange notes in Wren's journal, Julia's desperate warning. It all made a twisted kind of sense. "The restoration process," she gasped. "It's not just about cleaning the paintings, it's feeding them," Blackwood finished for her, his eyes gleaming with fanatical light. Every brushstroke, every touch, draws the restorer closer to the canvas, until finally they become a part of the artwork themselves. Amelia tried to pull away, but Blackwood's grip was like iron. Around them, the collectors watched with anticipation, their faces a blur of hunger and excitement. "Don't fight it, my dear," Blackwood whispered. "Embrace your destiny. Become a part of something greater than yourself. Immortality awaits you on the canvas." As he spoke, Amelia felt a tugging sensation, as if hooks had latched onto her very soul. The paintings seemed to loom closer, their frames expanding like gaping maws ready to swallow her whole. With a surge of desperate strength, Amelia wrenched herself free from Blackwood's grasp. She ran, pushing past the startled collectors, her feet pounding against the polished floor of the gallery. Behind her, she heard Blackwood's voice, no longer smooth and controlled, but a guttural roar of rage. Stop her! She mustn't escape. Amelia raced through the twisting corridors of the museum, the walls seeming to shift and change around her. Paintings flew past in a blur of color and screaming faces. She could hear footsteps pounding behind her, getting closer with each passing second. As she rounded a corner, she found herself face to face with a blank canvas, larger than any she had seen before. For a moment she hesitated, transfixed by its pristine white surface. Then to her horror, she saw her own reflection beginning to form on the canvas like an image emerging from fog. She could feel the pull of the painting, stronger than ever before, threatening to draw her in. With a scream of defiance, Amelia lashed out, her fist connecting with the canvas. There was a sound like shattering glass, and suddenly, the world around her began to fracture and crumble. The last thing she saw before consciousness slipped away was the face of Mr. Blackwood, contorted in a mixture of rage and fear, as he too began to dissolve like wet paint running down a canvas. Amelia awoke with a start, her heart pounding. She was lying on the floor of her studio apartment, surrounded by half-finished paintings and art supplies. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the busy sounds of the city drifted up from the street below. For a long moment she lay there, trying to reconcile the vivid horrors of her dream with the mundane reality around her. It had all felt so real. The Blackwood Museum, the living paintings, the terror of nearly being consumed by Wren's cursed artwork. As she pushed herself up, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles, her eyes fell upon her easel. The canvas she had been working on the night before stood there, innocently reflecting the morning light. But something was different. Where there had once been a half-finished landscape, there was now a portrait. A woman with auburn hair and piercing green eyes stared out from the canvas, her face a mask of desperate pleading. Julia Davenport. As Amelia watched, frozen in horror, Julia's lips moved, forming two silent words. Help me. The clock on Amelia Fenton's nightstand ticked relentlessly, each second a thunderous reminder of time's inexorable march. She sat on the edge of her bed, eyes fixed on the painting that now dominated her small studio apartment. Julia Davenport's face stared back at her, a silent scream etched into every brushstroke. 3 days had passed since Amelia had awoken from what she had desperately hoped was just a nightmare. 3 days of barely eating, barely sleeping, as she grappled with the impossible reality before her. She had tried to destroy the painting, burning it, cutting it, even attempting to wash away the pigments. But nothing worked. Each morning, the portrait would reappear, unblemished and ever more lifelike. And it wasn't just Julia anymore. Other faces had begun to appear in the background of the painting, emerging from the shadows like lost souls clawing their way out of the abyss. Amelia recognized some of them from the nightmarish gallery of her dreams. Or were they memories? Their eyes pleading, accusing, hungry. A soft knock at the door made Amelia jump, her heart racing. She hadn't left the apartment since that first morning, ignoring calls from friends and family. Now, as the knocking grew more insistent, she felt a cold dread settle in the pit of her stomach. "Ms. Fenton, are you there? It's Detective Harding. We need to talk." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She moved silently to the door, pressing her eye to the peephole. A man in a rumpled suit stood in the hallway, his weathered face creased with concern. Behind him, partially obscured, was a taller figure that made Amelia's blood run cold. "Mr. Blackwood." "Miss Fenton, please. We're investigating the disappearance of Julia Davenport. We have reason to believe you might have information that could help us." Amelia's mind raced. How could they be here? How could Blackwood be here? It had all been a dream, hadn't it? With trembling hands, she opened the door, leaving the chain in place. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Detective Harding's eyes softened with relief. "Thank you for answering. May we come in? We just have a few questions." Amelia's gaze flicked to Blackwood, who stood impassively behind the detective, his face an expressionless mask. She swallowed hard, weighing her options. If she refused, would they force their way in? If she let them in, What horrors awaited her? Finally, decision made, she closed the door. The sound of the chain sliding free seemed to echo in the small apartment. She opened the door fully, stepping back to allow them entry. Detective Harding entered first, his eyes sweeping the cluttered space. Blackwood followed, his tall frame seeming to fill the doorway. As he crossed the threshold, Amelia felt a change in the air, as if all the warmth had suddenly been sucked out of the room. "Ms. Fenton," Harding began, pulling out a notepad. "When was the last time you saw or spoke to Julia Davenport?" Amelia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could she explain what had happened? That Julia was trapped in a painting. That she herself had nearly suffered the same fate in a museum that may or may not exist. I'm not sure, she finally managed. It's all a bit of a blur. Harding frowned, making a note. "You two worked together, didn't you, at the Blackwood Museum?" At the mention of the museum, Amelia's eyes darted to Blackwood. His face remained impassive, but there was a glint in his eye that sent a shiver down her spine. "No," Amelia said quickly. "I mean, I don't think so. I've never been to any Blackwood Museum." Harding's frown deepened. "Ms. Fenton, we have records of your employment there. Mr. Blackwood here says you were hired to continue Ms. Davenport's work after she left." Blackwood stepped forward then, his voice smooth and controlled. "Perhaps I can help clarify the situation, Detective. Ms. Fenton has been under a great deal of stress lately. The restoration work is quite demanding, and I fear it may have affected her memory." As he spoke, Amelia felt a familiar tugging sensation, as if hooks had latched onto her very soul. The room seemed to swim around her, the walls rippling like disturbed water. "No," she whispered, backing away. "This isn't real. You're not real." Harding looked at her with growing concern. "Ms. Fenton, are you feeling all right? Do you need medical assistance?" But Amelia wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the painting of Julia, which now seemed to pulse with an inner light. The other faces in the background were becoming clearer, pushing their way to the forefront. And behind them all, emerging from the shadows like a nightmare-given form, was the leering face of Elias Wren himself. "You see it now, don't you?" Blackwood's voice had changed, becoming deeper, more resonant. When Amelia turned to look at him, she gasped in horror. His face was melting, the flesh running like wax to reveal the timeless, hungry visage of Wren beneath. "What's happening?" Harding's voice seemed to come from far away. "Mr. Blackwood, what's going on here?" But Blackwood, or Wren, or whatever unholy amalgamation he had become, paid the detective no mind. His eyes, now black as pitch, were fixed solely on Amelia. "You thought you could escape," he said, his voice a chorus of countless trapped souls. "But once you've touched the canvas, once you've felt the pull of true art, there is no escape. You belong to the gallery now, Amelia. Just as Julia does. Just as they all do." The walls of the apartment were gone now, replaced by the vast, nightmarish expanse of the Blackwood Museum. Paintings stretched in every direction, their subjects writhing in silent agony. Amelia saw Julia reaching out to her, her eyes wide with terror and resignation. Harding was shouting something, his gun drawn, but his voice was fading, becoming little more than a distant echo. Amelia watched in horror as his form began to waver and dissolve, pulled into a nearby canvas where his terrified face joined countless others. "You see?" Wren Blackwood said, gesturing to the gallery around them. "This is the true nature of art. Not mere pigments on canvas, but life itself, captured for eternity. And you, my dear Amelia, you have the gift. The ability to bridge the gap between worlds, to feed the hunger of the paint." Amelia felt herself being drawn toward a massive blank canvas that dominated the far wall of the gallery. She tried to resist, to run, but her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her inexorably toward her fate. "Don't fight it," Wren's voice whispered, now seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Embrace your destiny. Become one with the art. Live forever in the brushstrokes and the paint." As Amelia reached the canvas, she saw her reflection beginning to form on its surface. But it wasn't just her. She could see every person she had ever known, every place she had ever been, all swirling together in a maelstrom of color and form. With the last vestiges of her will, Amelia turned to face Wren Blackwood. "You're wrong," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "This isn't art. It's torture. It's a perversion of everything art should be. She reached out, her fingers brushing the surface of the canvas behind her. True art gives life, it doesn't take it. As her words echoed through the gallery, something began to change. The faces in the paintings stirred, their eyes focusing on Amelia with a new intensity. She felt a surge of energy flowing through her, the combined will of countless trapped souls lending her strength. "No!" Wren roared, his form twisting and warping as he lunged toward her. "You cannot undo what has been done." But it was too late. Amelia pressed her hand fully against the canvas, and the world exploded in a riot of color and sound. She felt herself falling, tumbling through a kaleidoscope of images and sensations. Voices cried out around her, in pain, in fear, but also in hope and exultation. When Amelia opened her eyes, she found herself lying on the floor of a sun-drenched studio. Easels and canvases surrounded her, but these were filled with vibrant landscapes, joyful portraits, and abstract explosions of color. There was life in these paintings, but it was the life of creation, not imprisonment. Slowly she sat up, her head spinning. As her vision cleared, she saw that she wasn't alone. Julia Davenport stood nearby, looking dazed but very much alive, and beyond her, dozens of others, all the souls that had been trapped in Wren's nightmarish gallery. "What happened?" Julia asked, her voice hoarse as if from long disuse. "Are we free?" Amelia nodded, a smile spreading across her face despite the tears in her eyes. "I think so. I think we broke the curse." As the former prisoners of the canvas began to laugh and cry, embracing each other in joy and relief, Amelia's gaze was drawn to a small painting propped against the far wall. It depicted a decrepit mansion, its windows dark and forbidding. And in one of those windows, barely visible, was a face contorted in eternal rage and hunger. Elias Wren, she realized. Trapped in his own creation, just as he had trapped so many others. Amelia turned away from the painting, focusing instead on the vibrant life around her. There would be time later to decide what to do with Wren's legacy, how to ensure that his particular brand of horror never again found its way into the world. And as she put brush to canvas, the colors flowing freely and joyously, Amelia felt the last vestiges of the nightmare fade away. The silent gallery was no more. In its place was a symphony of color and life, a testament to the true power of art to uplift and inspire. She painted long into the night, surrounded by the laughter and chatter of the freed souls. And with each brushstroke, with each splash of color, Amelia knew that she was not just creating art. She was creating hope.